So this is the first of a series of mini lectures you'll be watching over the course of the semester. As I've probably already said in class, the idea here is to present you with some necessary historical and cultural information in a useful and efficient manner. This saves you the time and trouble of having to read about this stuff, and it saves us all class time to do some more interesting things with the materials. After the video, I'll ask you to take a quick survey to give me some feedback on just how useful this video has been. The first stage of American literature we'll be exploring this semester is often just referred to as the Puritan era, even though that label is a bit of a misnomer. It might be better to call it the pre-colonial era, since it spans most of the 17th century and the early part of the 18th century, when the country began to take shape into the 13 colonies. Whatever we call it, this era in a literary sense is not very extensive. Books were still very expensive and laborious to produce, and the novel didn't yet exist in the Western mind, believe it or not. Moreover, the people settling in the New World were devoutly religious and highly industrious and saw no need for a literature of entertainment. The books they brought with them were 100 years. The 16th century in Europe was a time of great social upheaval. The primary factor of this social upheaval was the Protestant Reformation that began when a monk named Martin Luther nailed 95 theses or challenges against the Roman Church to the doors of Wittenberg Church. Luther saw the Catholic Church as corrupt and abusive. His ideas sparked the Reformation that spread across Europe. In addition to Luther in Germany, you had Calvin in France, and eventually Henry VIII in England. It's how the Reformation takes shape in England that is most important to us today. If you've watched the Showtime series The Tudors, you know very condensed. When Henry broke with the Catholic Church because he wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and marry Anne Boleyn. To do so, Henry named himself head of the Church of England, arguing that his subjects could not divide their loyalty between an English king and a Roman pope. After Henry died in 1547, England fell into a cycle of back and forth between Protestantism and Catholicism. However, even after the country began to stabilize for once and all as Protestant, many people still saw the new Church of England as a bloated institution that had fallen away from the true faith of Christianity. Various groups called dissenters their own ways of keeping the faith. Some wanted to further reform the church, others wanted to start all over. They faced a unique problem, though, as English dissenters, because Henry had made the Church of England a state institution. Any opposition to the church could and was often seen as opposition to the crown, and thus as treason. We're concerned here with dissenters. In 1607, a group calling themselves Pilgrims, led by William Bradford, left England for Holland. As separatists who wanted to break away from the church entirely, the Pilgrims hoped to find greater religious freedom in Holland, which they did, but they quickly became concerned that their children were assimilating too easily into Dutch society. After returning to England briefly, Bradford and the other leaders got the Merchants Association, a corporation, to fund their exodus to the New World on board the Mayflower. In 1620, they landed and established Plymouth Colony. William Bradford would serve as governor of the Plymouth Colony in 1657. His narrative of Plymouth Plantation gives a thorough account of their travels, their struggles, including their near starvation and what became the first Thanksgiving, as well as the colony's decline. In 1630, Puritans, led by John Winthrop, also fled England. Unlike the Pilgrims, the Puritans were reformists. They wanted to stay a part of the Church of England, but fix the problems they saw in it. They left for the New World aboard the Arabella and 2 other ships, hoping to establish a purified version of the Church of England. In June 1630, Boston and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Winthrop gave a sermon that served as something of a pep talk on board the Arabella, the model of Christian charity, which lays out important ideals that are at the core of American society, including a strong notion of community, which was central to the Puritan worldview. The real point of all this history is that the 2 elements in the New World were these dissenters, who for the sake of simplicity we'll just call it the Puritans. They established settlements as religious communities and saw themselves as something exceptional. This is an important point to the history, the literature, and the formation of American culture. Everything about Puritan society revolved around beliefs, so it's important we understand the basis of those. Puritanism is a strict form of Calvinism, one that sees God as all-powerful and fully sovereign. There's an easy mnemonic device to help remember the tenets of Puritanism. It's called TULIP, T-U-L-I-P. The first idea is total depravity. This is an extension of the standard idea of original sin that many of us are familiar with. The Puritans believed that because Adam and Eve's defiance of God's will in the Garden of Eden, all of humanity has been eternally damned. U stands for unconditional election. And this is an extreme interpretation of the idea of predestination that some of you may be familiar with. The Puritans believe that since the beginning of time, God has known who will be saved and who will be damned. L is limited atonement. This claims that Christ died only to save God's chosen people, only those people who have, since the beginning of time, been labeled as saved by God. I is irresistible grace. Moreover, God's grace is only extended, again, to those chosen people and no one else. And P, perseverance of the saints. Even moreover, God's grace is so strong you can't have it revoked. If God has selected you as one of the chosen, you will be saved. One thing you want to think about as we are discussing all this and reading the writings of the Puritans is this. How does this mindset affect your approach to life? If you believe that you are the chosen people of God, the only people in the history of the world to receive God's grace, how would you live your life? There are two other stylistic aspects of Puritan thought I want us to consider and look for as we read. One is the idea of typology, the other plain style. The latter is pretty easy to address. Plain style is just that, a style of writing and speaking clearly. One of the many reforms desired by the English dissenters was to strip the Church of England of all the trappings and decorations of the Roman Church. They tore down statues and tapestries and rewrote the liturgy and ultimately the Bible to purify it of excessive language. The basic rule of plain style was to use, quote, simple words in clear order. Plain style can be best summed up in the words of John Cotton, who wrote the Bay Psalm book, a simplified version of the Psalms, and the first book printed in British North America. He said, quote, God's altar needs not our polishing. But this is also an important reform as it made the Word of God more accessible to a public that was only slightly literate. The other concept, typology, is a bit more difficult to describe, but critical to help us understand Puritan thinking. In its original sense, typology served as a method of biblical interpretation. A typological analysis interpreted the stories of the Old Testament as prefigurations of the stories in the New Testament. With typology, you have two components. The type, which is the original model. Imagine the mold my son uses when he makes Play-Doh food. And the antitype, the thing produced with that type or cast. Returning to the Play-Doh metaphor, this is the food my son makes with the mold. Ultimately, think about it this way. What's more important for my son when he's playing with Play-Doh? The mold or the thing that he produces with that mold? In typological analysis, you can only truly understand the type after you have experienced the antitype. It's only after the appearance of the antitype that the true meaning of the type is revealed. What's an obvious type-antitype pairing? Who is a character from the Old Testament who serves as a model for a character in the New Testament? What about Moses and Jesus? Moses brought his people the Ten Commandments. Jesus brought his followers the one great commandment. Moses led his people to the Promised Land. Jesus leads his followers to heaven. It gets more complex than that, but you get the idea. And ultimately, you see how in the Puritan form of analysis, of biblical analysis, what's more important to them is the figure of Christ, more so than the figure of Moses. Ultimately, Moses isn't important except to help us understand Christ. The Puritans took this way of thinking further by applying it to their lives. They began using the stories in the Bible as a way to understand what happened to them. Thus, the characters in the Bible were the types, and the Puritans themselves were the antitypes. What's an obvious example? What story from the Bible would speak to people being persecuted for their religious beliefs? Again, we go back to Moses, but this time we think about the Israelites. Think about it. This is more than just a comparison. Everything has meaning. This is a mindset that says the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt exists only to serve as a model for the Puritans, this small group of people, 6,000 years later. It's both comforting and ennobling, isn't it? It's also a form of justification, isn't it? If you see yourselves as God's chosen people, everything you do is by God's will. It's theology for today. Keep these things in mind as you read Mary Rowlandson's narrative. Think about how she uses that way of thinking to tell her story, to understand her story. In particular, think about how she's using typology as a way to help her deal with the trials and tribulations she's going through. Remember that the Puritans didn't use literature as a form of entertainment. Literature, what there was of it, was a means of professing and justifying their faith. So be looking for ways Rowlandson expresses this mindset throughout her story. Thanks for watching. Remember to take the survey right after this so I can make future videos even better. Thanks again. See you in class.